Good morning and welcome to the 105th episode of the Veritas fact-finding series. And today I'm joined by my special guest, Jon Dellandrea. Good morning, John.
Morning.
In each episode of the fact-finding series, we go on the ground to speak to industry professionals in an unscripted, live, candid video format to discover how we can make better investment decisions. In this series and with everything we do, we believe that the facts empower investors and that better information leads to better investment decisions. If you're watching and you like what you hear, give us a like and follow us at www.veritascorp.com. By the way, a background, my name is Anthony Scilipoti. I'm the president and CEO of Veritas, which is an independent equity research firm based in Toronto, Canada. I'm proud to say this year, 23 years, 100% employee owned and operated. Quick disclaimer, this broadcast is not to be taken as investment advice, and participants or employees of the Veritas group of companies may own securities discussed in this broadcast. And while we love all our guests, and John in particular, this session may contain forward-looking statements, investment opinions, and comments that we do not agree with at all. Now, quick update on John's bio. I could go on half an hour just telling you about all the intricacies about Jon. But what I want to, this is the second time I've had the pleasure of introducing Jon. He spoke at the Veritas Foundation V500 Charity Awards for the fastest growing charities in Canada. He was our keynote speaker. And I described him at the time as a truth warrior. And that's what really endeared me to him when I read his bio and learned more about him. He's an author, a scholar, an art historian, an art detective, an academic, a community volunteer, and a creative, curious, inquisitive soul. He went to U of T with an undergraduate, master's, and doctoral degrees, and bestowed with a Master's of Arts by resolution from the University of Oxford. He has an amicus arts liberalis from the University of Waterloo and honorary doctorates from both Nipissing University and the University of Toronto. He served as chancellor, chief advancement officer, vice president development, president of Mount Sinai Hospital Foundation, president and CEO of Sunnybrook. He's written numerous books on philanthropy and led many campaigns in many ways to make Canada a better place. Jon, thanks for taking the time with us today.
That sounded exhausting. I do all that
in your short 30 years.
My short 30 years.
Quite amazing. So, Jon, why don't, in your own words, tell us about yourself. Why is it that you do what you do, and what propelled you to become so involved in philanthropy?
Sure. So, the short version of the story is that I was destined to be a university professor. And was working at the University of Toronto back in this, I'm now demonstrating that I am slightly older than 30.
Yeah.
Back in the 1970s, when the late John Evans was president of the University of Toronto. John went on to be chairman of Alcan, chair of Torstar, but that's not the point. John looked at the kind of social structure of the country, including universities, and said, this is really quite simple. That we cannot sustain great institutions on simply the money that comes from the taxpayers, the fees in the case of universities paid by students, without, and I don't think we even used the word philanthropy in those days, without private support. In fact, the department was called the Department of Private Funding, right? And John, it was pretty straightforward, right? John said, if we're going to compete with the very best universities in the world, we've got to bring private funding to the table. And he turned to me, this is a literally true story. He said, there are not very many people who do this line of work, and you actually might be quite good at it. So why don't you come? So John Evans gave me that job, and that's what started what's been a 35-year career of serving privately funded philanthropic organizations. That's the long answer to that.
No, it's amazing. Well, the opportunity met your ability, and
well, and it's also, I think it's a commercial for, in the small c sense of that word, it's a commercial for visionary thinking in terms of business leaders, right? It's the ability of some people to kind of look at the world and say, doing it the same way it's been done for the last 30 years is not going to get us where we're going, which I suspect is a bit of a metaphor for your business as well. Right?
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. And you know, I have to congratulate you. Now you're our third guest with the Order of Canada. You got that award in 2006, and I think that's just phenomenal. Just shows the impact that you have had on this country. I noticed on your bio, I've been saving it here. I see that you're currently serving as advancement counsel to the Canada's world famous Perimeter Institute of Theoretical Physics. Tell us about that.
So this is again one of those great seminal moments of philanthropy. It was 25 years ago that Mike Lazaridis, who invented the smartphone, the founder of BlackBerry, had made quite a lot of money, and Mike looked around at everything, including your BlackBerry that you used to carry. The technology of all of that is theoretical physics. So everything that we were chatting before we started, everything that we take for granted, airplanes, cars, computers, telephones, diagnostic imaging, it's all, the technology is all theoretical physics. So Mike's view was create a place and bring the smartest people in the world together, turn them loose, let them think without having to teach undergraduate students, go to committee meetings, whatever, and you don't know where it's going to land, but you know it's going to change the world. So everybody on this event this morning will have seen in one newspaper or another about 6 or 7 months ago that front page image, the first image of a black hole. That work, much of that work came out of the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics. So this is world-changing stuff where you look at the impact of AI in the future. Nobody really knows where that's going to land. Quantum computing, everybody talks about quantum computing. Nobody actually really knows what they're talking about, or where it's going to land. But you know, if you get smart people, and this would not be happening absent of one guy and then some other guys and gals stepping up and saying, we're prepared to make the big bet. So sometimes philanthropy is not just simply giving money to your local hospital or your local charity. It's having the courage to make the big bet. So that was a big bet, and it's doing just unbelievable things.
How much money has been raised for that?
So the endowment of Perimeter now is about $400 million. And
wow.
The governments of both Canada and Ontario support in meaningful ways, between the two of them, about 25 million a year. And it's almost a third of private philanthropy and government support there as well. Right? But it's remarkable. And the test of it is that 8 or 10 years ago, if you measure research output in theoretical physics in the world, Canada was number 8. Perimeter Canada is now number 1. You take Perimeter back out, we go back to number 8.
Really?
So there's we're great self-effacing Canadians, right? We don't like to boast, but this is literally Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, who spent time at Perimeter, said this is the single most important activity in theoretical physics in the world. And coming from a guy who was arguably the most important theoretical physicist, that's pretty good.
Yeah,
that's pretty good.
Look at you. Who knew? So let's talk a little bit more now about philanthropy. Why should an individual or an organization take part in it? And what sort of advice do you have for that?
So, I mean, at one level, it's a complicated, it's one level, it's a simple question, and the other level, it's a complicated question. All one has to do is sort of travel around the world, as you and many of your customers and clients and friends do, and you realize how privileged we are to live in this country.
That's for sure.
And the things, look at, notwithstanding the whinging that we do about healthcare occasionally and the rest of it, in point of fact, we live in a spectacular country. And the things, whether it's higher education or healthcare or arts and cultural stuff, it's unsustainable absent of people stepping up and assisting. And I maybe this is a kind of crazy old-fashioned notion, but I think there is a moral suasion. I think there's a moral responsibility for people who do well in this country and elsewhere to think about how they give back and invest in that quality of social infrastructure that we sometimes unfortunately take for granted.
What sort of specific pieces of advice for advisors? I know there's a number of those on the line, or portfolio managers, analysts, et cetera, things that they could think about.
So absolutely. I mean, the one piece of advice I give to people when asked is pick your spot and make a difference. Right? I mean, everybody responds, not everybody, but most people respond to the request for a couple $100 to the food bank and whatever. You just do that you don't even have to think about it. You just take your credit card out and do it. But I think with portfolio managers, with financial advisors who are dealing with high net worth clients, people who are doing well, they can play, to me, a key role in saying, kind of as you're thinking about how well you're doing in notwithstanding the current state of the markets, but when markets are terrific, as you think about what you're doing with your money, it's not just your private school for your kids and your spot in the Muskokas for the weekend and the rest of it. What are you doing to make a difference? That's the charge, I think.
And that way, and put enough money and emphasis behind it so that it can actually make a difference.
Yeah, and the other thing, if I may, that you do that I've seen happening is, which I think is fabulous, is people who are at their sort of mid-career and doing well and have got kids who are coming up through the primary and secondary school system, is start to educate your kids. I know a number of people who've had pretty decent liquidity events, who've taken a chunk of money, put it into a donor advised fund, and given their children responsibility for some percentage of the annual disbursements within those family foundations. And then you're growing the next generation of philanthropists, which I think is hugely important.
What a plug. And that's why we launched our Veritas donor advised fund. And the whole mission behind our foundation is to empower philanthropic capital by making people more aware of it, identifying those charities that are having more impact, better governance, etc. And I think that's going to improve the state of our philanthropic sector.
Well, for sure.
So let's talk a little bit of detail about what's going on in Canada with philanthropy. At the Veritas Foundation, we just published a report. We did a study over the last 5 years looking at how Canadians give. And based on our study, the dollar amounts of donations in Canada has increased by about 15% over the last 5 years in absolute dollars, and it's remained relatively constant at the same percentage of GDP, just under about 0.66%. But it's coming from a more concentrated group of individuals. What do you think's going on, and why?
Yeah, I read the report and I thought it was really, really interesting. That was not damning with faint praise. I really found it interesting.
Yes.
But one of the interesting bits on those kinds of studies is getting kind of underneath the numbers and seeing what do the numbers precisely mean. Right? Because sometimes if one deals with kind of gross statistics, there are patterns there, but the patterns don't tell you anything. Right? I mean, they tell you something arithmetically, but they don't tell you anything about what's going on socially. I think what we are seeing, and you see it particularly with events that trigger it. I give as an example, during the 3 crazy years of COVID, assuming that the 3 crazy years are over, but during the early phase when people were really, really, really heightened attention to the implications of COVID, the community guy at the time was president and CEO of the Sunnybrook Foundation.
Yes.
And Sunnybrook actually sequenced the gene for the first work on COVID in the world. The community support of people who had never supported the hospital before was remarkable. So that was, and it was very, very specific. Right? It wasn't just give to a great institution. It was how do you do very, very effective things. So I think you get some social triggers along the way that drive it. This is not an answer to your question. I'm not.
You're getting there.
Yeah, I was probably getting there. I don't know exactly what we're seeing, because what I see from kind of on the ground is significantly increased in a particular stratum of sizes of philanthropic investments.
And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing fewer individuals and organizations make the donations, but those donations are larger in size.
Yeah.
And so, as a percentage of taxable income, it's been roughly 0.8%. Do you think that's enough? Is there some kind of metric that you'd say, this is how much an individual should look to give?
I don't know. I mean, there's for the people who grew up in different particular religions, there are some religions where there are very explicit expectations
That's true.
that people are giving 10% is a number that often shows up.
That's true.
So I don't know what the magic number is, but the number that really, really bugs me is people who have significant resources whose percentage is 0. Those are the people that bug me most.
Interesting. If you look at individual donations, our study shows that amounts increased 19% over the last 5 years, but they increased only 11% on a per capita basis. So what do you think of that?
I don't know. I'd turn the question back to you and ask you what that number tells you.
You know, it's similar, where more, if there's fewer people making larger donations, and is it that, you know, we're having, like, this could take us into a bigger discussion, but, you know, we've obviously seen a significant ramp up in immigration into this country, especially over the last 7 years. And has that had an impact in your mind, given the organizations and what you've seen?
Yeah, I'm not sure, because you look, I mean, this is a wonderfully diverse country that we live in. And I spent 11 years as vice president at the University of Toronto, and U of T has something in excess of 150 languages.
Wow.
Spoken within the university. It's the largest university now, I think, north of the Rio Grande, and something in excess of 50% of the student population was born outside of Canada.
Right.
And within that cohort, you find particular ethnic groups where there's a strong tradition of philanthropy. If you look, I mean, there is no single Chinese community, there are multi-Chinese communities, but there's a long tradition within Chinese communities of looking after elders, of looking after health of the community. So you see very quickly a philanthropic base come in with a lot of those immigrant communities.
Have you started to see some of the organizations take kind of embrace this in a sense where they're changing their messaging, their marketing in other languages?
Absolutely. It's like any other quote unquote business, right? You're responsive to the marketplace. So yes, you see a lot of that.
Now let's talk a little bit about gender in relation to philanthropy. It seems men represent 52% of donors and 65% of the value of donations. Anything that you've seen in your?
No, I read it, and my conclusion on this is we are chauvinists. How many times do you see organizations? I've seen it time and time again.
Yes.
Where you look at the so-called prospect list of prospective supporters.
Yes.
It's pretty male dominated, right? Because people think about, you know, I know good old Joe who works down in a brokerage near me on Bay Street. Let's go talk to good old Joe. But in fact, good old Jane, who happens to be Joe's wife, is really the person who makes the decisions. Yes. In the family, right? So again, there was a very, very funny moment. If I tell a very fast story, a very funny moment years ago at the University of Toronto, and we had in two rather famous Canadians, and the husband had made many millions of dollars.
Yes.
And the wife was a graduate of University of Toronto. He was a graduate of Queen's. And the president of the university and I were sitting at a table for lunch in his office, and the president's giving the pitch to the male here. And I was watching what was going on, and there was no facial response. You're smiling right now. This was kind of deadpan. And after about 5 minutes of a pretty eloquent pitch, this man said to the president of the university, "I don't know why you're talking to me. She's the graduate of the University of Toronto. She's the one that's interested. You talk to her." So now,
I love it.
If you drive through the university of campus, you'll find the Isabel Bader Theater at
Yes.
Victoria. That was Isabel Bader.
And you know, I think you see that very often. I work a lot with advisors as well, and I think when they're also giving pitches and portfolio reviews is really to focus on the spouse. Absolutely. Who may not be the one that's daily involved in the communication. Once you bring them into the discussion, you know, all kinds of things flourish.
It's a different discussion, and we have seen some really interesting discussions where the husband and wife have brought in their children.
Yes.
We're not talking about little kids, you know, we're talking in some cases
adult
first and second
sure.
year university students or whatever. That becomes a different discussion, because that group of young people have slightly different ideas. They don't care about their name on the side of a building, right? They care about the impact of the dollars, and it refocuses the conversation in really interesting ways.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because you, having been involved with such large institutions as well in art and in education and of course in healthcare, you see that, right? The naming of buildings and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about some stories that you've seen associated with that and what's actually happening and so forth?
So I'm sure somebody is going, if they haven't already, some psychologist is going to write a really interesting book on this subject. I mean, there is at one level, right? There is a point where the cynic could say, this is search for status symbol, this is search for recognition, this is search for being seen as being important. That's not what we see most often. You take, for example, the late Peter Monk, who was a friend of mine. Peter, whose name is up on University Avenue on the Heart Center. Peter did it because
the Heart Center.
Because it was the Heart Center, right? The late Ted Rogers, who had issues with his eyes, the money that Ted put in for work there. So I think you see very personal bits. Every once in a while, there's somebody who comes along that's just made a whole lot of money, and they want to do something visible. And so then it becomes the discussion about, well, we're actually about to build a new center for X. Well, why can't this be the John Smith Center for X? So I'm not sure where that psychology leads, but it's all good stuff.
If anyone has a question for John, if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, hover over the Q&A, be great, and I'll get the question and be sure to address it to John. John, there's so many, obviously, issues that we're faced here with in Canada: poverty, housing, affordability. There obviously, you touched on healthcare, but there's even, ability to afford university and post-secondary schooling. Can you speak to sort of what are the areas that you think, if you had to advise high net worth individuals, and even perhaps those that are of lower means, to where to give today in Canada? What are some of the things you think about?
I mean, there's lots of examples. If one goes back to, you cite examples, the accessibility of higher education. There's no question that the future prosperity of any society is substantially driven by the quality of education in the population. It just goes without saying. There was a great example back in the 90s when the government of Ontario brought in something called the Ontario Student Opportunity Trust Fund and offered matching is powerful stuff in philanthropy. Right? So we had for a period of time the government matching every dollar that was given privately. The University of Toronto happened to have some money in the endowment that had been set aside for exactly that kind of purpose. What's the point of this story? The point of the story is in a period of about 4 or 5 years, the total endowment for student aid at the U of T went from 50 million to over 500 million. Right. And so the theory, Rob Pritchard was president of the university at the time.
Yeah.
That the theory was that every student who's smart enough to deserve a place at great universities like the University of Toronto, not exclusively, obviously, and they should be able to attend whether they come from a rich family or a poor family. Right. When I was at Oxford, and that was the big issue for Oxford and Cambridge, was to do what was best described by somebody as needs blind admissions. Right? You just. It doesn't matter whether the person's rich or poor. Is this a really, really smart student that deserves a place? So that is an example of where it makes a difference. Our cultural institutions. I'm the former board chair of the Art Canada Institute, which is doing wonderful work across the country of producing online English and French free of charge books on art history to make art part of a national conversation. ACI is the acronym is totally privately supported, right? Totally privately supported. So there's lots of examples through higher education, through healthcare. The ones that are, I think, the difficult ones to really get at is the gross inequity. And I talked a little bit at that night that you kind of invited me to your event. The gap between the rich and the poor, right, is going like this. It's not going like that. And how does one intervene there? You talk to the people who are running the food banks, and they're pulling their hair out.
You got it.
Right? So I would encourage anybody who's got any money to look to things like the food banks, and just, I do it personally, just lock yourself into monthly donation that you're the only thing you're ever going to do to it is maybe increase it over the years, but you're never going to cancel it. And you build that base of support. So those organizations can do their work.
We run a food drive here every spring and every fall with our Veritas Foundation, and last fall we raised about $3,500, and every penny goes to to buy food.
And it makes a huge difference, right? You talk about the work that you do on kind of measuring efficiency and cost effectiveness. That's one of the things that one often hears from people thinking about how they can kind of express themselves more philanthropically, is this question of how much my money actually goes for where I'm giving it.
Correct.
That's the big issue, to be able to know with confidence that 90 cents in your dollar, or 95 cents, or sometimes 100 cents on your dollar are going for exactly where you designated.
And that's what we thought of is we want to, empower the capital. So if instead of making donations with your heart, you're making them with your brain.
Yeah.
That I think the money's going to go to a better place.
Yeah, for sure.
We have a great question that's come in. If anybody has more questions, just hover over the bottom of the screen there, over the Q&A. So Nancy, thanks for the question. And there's talk in the community foundation movement that money should be distributed and not endowed to get most impact now. Can you comment on that?
Sure. I mean, it is a debate for sure. And there have been some minor changes in the so-called disbursement rules for foundations,
moving it to 5%.
Right. I'm of the view, and I may be a heretic on this one, but I'm happy to be. Wouldn't be the first time in my life. I think it's way too low. I think there are two issues. I think one is there should be much greater disbursement. I don't know what the right number is, but the other one, and we've seen some leadership in this area, of using some of the money that's sitting in those foundations to actually make investments in bright ideas that have the potential to have a very, very positive material effect, as opposed to simply it becomes then kind of venture philanthropy, I think is the way it's being described. I think more of that, because there's some great success stories. The McConnell Foundation in Montreal, the J.W. McConnell Foundation at one point, I think, was Canada's largest foundation. For the past number of years, they've taken, under the leadership of their previous chair, they've taken a significant chunk of their money and have used it to actually invest in ideas. And I think the early indications were that they were seeing some pretty spectacular returns on some of that. So I think there's another way to think about. We did it's too long an answer, but we did an arrangement with a major Canadian foundation at Sunnybrook in the area of brain sciences, where they actually, as part of their contribution, got an option on a certain percentage of potential intellectual property coming out, not to just go and spend and do whatever, but to invest back into the world of brain sciences. So you make a smart investment, you make good money on it, and it turns and feeds another round of philanthropy. So there's some interesting ways to think about this.
Interesting. We're going to be having John Shell, who runs a social impact type fund on our fact finder mission in the next few weeks, and he talked to exactly that point. So you didn't say a percentage. Is there a percentage you think that would make sense? So right now at 5 is.
So I guess it comes to the fundamental question of what you're trying to do.
Right.
If what you're trying to do is to endow a foundation that's going to be here 150 years from now for your children's children's children, and to continue good work in an area which is very close to your heart and important, that's not a bad thing to do. I mean, if you take a look at the big American foundations historically, of Sloan, of Carnegie, of Kresge, you can go on and on and on. I mean, over the years, they have had a remarkable impact as times have changed. And if they'd spent all the money up front, they would have done some good things in the 1890s and wouldn't be around today. So I can argue both sides of it. I'm ducking your question, but I mean, I understand the psychology of the 5% number because it's talking about
20 years.
It's exactly, that's a sustainability question.
And I think it's a good point. If you're thinking that this is the money that's going to endow something that's a vision forever almost, then that makes one sense. But if you want to change something now and affect the imbalances in equality related to the finances, then let's put the money to work now.
Right. And the endowment at places like the University of Toronto, as an example.
Yes.
That endowment is not just big pots of money that are sitting there in unrestricted endowment to do whatever. They're endowed faculty positions, their student support,
Yes.
their program support. So they're funding something, right?
Yes.
It's like having a bank account to help to run the place.
That's right. Let's, if anybody has any questions, go down to the bottom of your screen and we'll address them. Couple quick questions to leave you with that we always like to ask our guests here. Favorite podcast?
I'm not much of a podcast guy.
That's okay.
I'm so bloody busy doing other things. I tend not to be. I will not cheekily say the ones that I'm on, so we won't answer that question.
Okay, that's fine. How about a favorite book?
So there's a great book, he says with tongue in cheek, that I will strongly recommend to you. It's called The Great Canadian Art Fraud Case: Forgeries of the Group of Seven and Tom Thompson.
Geez, that was written by someone I might know.
Written by somebody you might know. And it's doing quite well at the top of, close to the top of the Amazon bestsellers for Canadian art. And
Written by yours truly.
by yours truly.
No, that the guest, yeah, Canadian art fraud case. Yeah.
So there's going to be a great piece. Actually, you're seeing a lot of stuff in the press these days on Morrison controversy. So
Yes.
there's a piece that will be in the opinion section and on this Saturday's Globe and Mail, which may also have been written by yours truly.
Oh,
So I'll recommend your reading.
I'm looking forward to that. I'm going to just launch our poll here. And then I'm going to ask you our last question. Favorite breakfast restaurant and meal?
So favorite breakfast restaurant, I don't have one because my mornings are taken up with morning exercise regularly. I hate breakfast meals. Every job I've always taken, I say, I want you to understand something about me. There's a kind of macho, right? We have meetings at 7 o'clock in the morning. If you do, count me out because I'm not going to be there. I'm going to be out running or something.
I love it.
So I'm dodging what's your favorite breakfast restaurant?
Any diner where I can get an interesting egg and bacon mix of some kind.
Franz or something.
Well, Franz would be interesting, yeah.
Cool.
But usually something a little bit more homey.
Yeah,
is what I'd prefer.
lots of fun.
Anyway, thanks for being on the show, John.
My pleasure.
It's really been wonderful,
Great.
and continued success and support and help.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.